Imagine the night. Not night as a metaphor for darkness, but as a physical, tangible substance. Thick, cold, smelling of smoke, ash, and something else. Something sickly sweet and nauseating for which the human tongue has never found a name. January 1938. The Yangtze River near the fallen city of Nanking. In the middle of the black, oily water, swaying slowly, drifts the flat, clumsy body of an old river barge. This is not a ship. It is a ghost. A rusty skeleton, hastily covered with scraps of tarpaulin under which shadows stir. Here, on this floating island of despair, there is no silence. There is only its semblance, woven from dozens of quiet, barely audible sounds, groans that people no longer have the strength to suppress, whispered prayers addressed to long-deaf gods, and the soft, incessant cry of a child who no longer remembers. His mother's face, on the stern, under the dim flickering light of a single kerosene lamp, a figure is bent over. This is Dr. Lin Wei. He is 32 years old, but now, in this ghostly light, his face is the mask of an old man. Deep wrinkles have carved his forehead, and his eyes hold a total, all-consuming indifference to everything but one thing: sterility. His hands, clad in rubber gloves boiled in river water, move with mechanical precision. The scalpel in his fingers does not tremble. He cuts into an inflamed wound on a soldier's leg, and the only sound that breaks the quiet is the scrape of steel on bone. Around him, like priestesses in this horrifying ritual, stand two young nurses. Their faces are gray with exhaustion and malnutrition, but their movements have the same practiced precision. One holds the lamp, the other passes swabs. They do not look at the wound. They look at the doctor's hands. Those hands are the only thing that still makes sense in their shattered world. There are 73 people on the barge. 30 of them are seriously wounded. The rest are women, old men, and children, snatched from the jaws of hell. For them, this rusty vessel, this box of rotting wood and metal, has become both an ark and a prison. By day, they drift in the middle of the river, trying to stay out of rifle range from either bank. And at night, they become ghosts, listening to every splash of water, every distant scream carried from the agonizing city. How did they come to this? How did a certified doctor, the star of Nanking surgery, become the captain of this ship of the damned? How did young girls who dreamed of love and family become silent angels of death, sorting those who still had a chance from those who had only a last sip of water left? This story is not recorded in military archives. It is not in the official chronicles. It survived only in fragments of memory, in the whispers of those who miraculously made it out, and it became a legend. The legend of a hospital that sailed away from the land so as not to drown in human cruelty. But to understand how a handful of medics created this floating fortress in the middle of a river of death, we must go back 40 days, to the day when the sky over Nanking had not yet turned black with smoke, and the river had not yet turned red with blood. To the day it all began. December 13th, 1937. The day before the Japanese army entered the city. The Nanking University Hospital still stood, an unshakable island of civilization amidst the rising chaos. Corridors gleaming with cleanliness, the smell of carbolic acid and ether, the quiet squeak of gurneys, and the hushed voices of the staff. Here, in this orderly world, Dr. Lin Wei was a god. His operating room was his temple, and the scalpel was his scepter. He was the best surgeon in the city, a man of cold logic and flawless technique. He considered emotions a hindrance, an unnecessary element that contaminated the purity of the medical craft. His hands never trembled, his voice never broke. He saved human bodies, but had no interest in their souls. That day, he performed 7 surgeries. He removed shrapnel from a soldier's liver, stitched a torn artery in a girl's neck, amputated an officer's shattered leg. He worked like a perfectly calibrated machine, oblivious to everything around him. He didn't hear the growing roar of the cannonade outside. He didn't see the fear in the nurse's eyes. He saw only damaged flesh that needed to be repaired. One of those nurses was Mei Ling. She was only 19, and she looked upon Dr. Lin with reverent awe. She believed in him as one believes in a higher power. She believed in the sanctity of their mission, in the inviolability of the Red Cross on their hospital's roof. She believed that as long as they were here, within these walls, they were safe. It was said that war does not touch doctors. It was the law, unwritten, but all the more unshakable for it. After the last surgery, late in the evening, he sat in his office making notes in his journal. His calligraphic handwriting covered the pages in neat, precise lines. Diagnoses, procedures, dosages. Nothing superfluous. Just then, Mei Ling entered his office. She brought him a cup of hot tea. Her hands trembled slightly. She asked him if it was true that the city would fall. Without looking up from his journal, he replied that it didn't matter. Their job was to treat people, regardless of which flag flew over the city wall. For him, it was a simple axiom, logical and irrefutable. But Mei Ling saw what he did not. She saw high-ranking officials and their families beginning to disappear from the hospital. She heard the orderlies whispering that the army had abandoned its positions. She could feel the air becoming thick with a sticky, animal fear. She tried to tell him, but he just waved her away. Panic was an irrational feeling, unworthy of a thinking man. Their hospital was under the protection of the International Committee. They were safe. He was finishing the last line when the distant rumble outside turned into a deafening roar. The building shuddered. A stack of books fell from his desk. Screams erupted in the corridor. Lin Wei slowly raised his head. For the first time in years, something akin to surprise appeared in his eyes. He didn't yet know that this was the sound of a world collapsing. His world. A world built on logic, rules, and laws. He looked at Mei Ling, at her frightened, pale face, and for the first time in his life he had nothing to say to her. He did not sleep that night. He stood at his office window and watched the glow spreading over the southern quarters of the city, never suspecting that this flame would soon consume everything he believed in, and force him, a solitary genius, to seek salvation, not in the sterile cleanliness of an operating room, but in the filthy, bloody water of the great river. The morning of December 14th brought no dawn. A thick shroud of smoke covered the sky, through which a crimson, sickly light barely penetrated. The air became heavy, difficult to breathe. With it, the smell of burning and fear entered the lungs, and then the floodgates opened. They poured into the hospital. These were no longer soldiers with neat bullet wounds. They were fragments of human bodies. Women with their bellies torn open, children with severed limbs, old men with their eyes burned out. They crawled, they screamed, they begged, filling the corridors, the wards, the staircases. Chaos had burst into Dr. Lin's orderly world and ripped it to shreds. For the first few hours, he and his team worked at the limits of human endurance. They were no longer operating. They were administering first aid, trying to stop the bleeding, set splints, do anything at all. But the number of wounded grew. The screams merged into one continuous, unbearable howl. And at some point, Lin Wei understood. This wasn't a hospital. It was a slaughterhouse. It was a trap. His mind, accustomed to analysis and systematization, began working with feverish speed. He saw the Japanese soldiers entering the building, at first just looking around, then their gazes turning more predatory. They singled out young nurses, dragging them into empty wards. They finished off wounded Chinese soldiers right on their stretchers. The Red Cross on the roof was no longer a symbol of protection. It had become a target. The point of no return came when he saw two soldiers trying to drag Mei Ling away. She fought back, scratching, screaming, but she was no match for them. At that moment, something inside Dr. Lin broke. The cold, dispassionate mechanism of his mind failed. He grabbed a heavy metal sterilizer from a table and without a second thought, brought it down with all his might on one of the soldiers' heads. The second one, stunned, let go of the girl and reached for his rifle. But Lin Wei was faster. He struck again, and again, and again, until two motionless bodies lay at his feet. A ringing silence fell. Everyone in the corridor froze, staring at him in horror and astonishment. He stood over the corpses, breathing heavily, clutching the blood-stained sterilizer. His white coat was spattered with blood, and in that moment, he realized a simple, monstrous truth. There is no salvation on land. Every building, every cellar, every street was a death trap. He looked at the terrified faces of his colleagues, a few remaining doctors and nurses. He saw in their eyes the same question that tormented him. What do we do? And then his gaze fell on the window. His office window overlooked the river. And there, at an abandoned pier, he saw it. An old rusty barge used for transporting coal. Wide, flat-bottomed, clumsy. And in his mind, amidst the chaos, an idea was born. A crazy, illogical idea, but the only one possible. He whispered a single word. Water. They didn't understand. He grabbed Mei Ling's hand and pulled her along. Gather morphine, sulfanilamide, bandages, everything you can carry, and all the walking wounded, quickly. His voice regained its former steely resolve. He was no longer a doctor. He was a commander. He had become the chief of a desperate tribe that had to be led out of a burning hell. He looked at his hands, stained with another's blood, then at the sterilizer locked in his grip. And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he would have to become not just their savior, but their tyrant and their god. The first and most difficult task was getting out of the hospital. The building was already swarming with Japanese soldiers who were methodically clearing it floor by floor. This was no longer the chaos of the first hour, but an organized extermination. Lin Wei, with his analytical mind, instantly assessed the situation. The main entrance was blocked. The way through the basements was likely blocked too. Only one escape route remained, through the morgue and the service yard that led to the river. He gathered those who could still move and think. 2 young doctors, 5 nurses including Mei Ling, and about a dozen lightly wounded soldiers who could wield the weapons taken from the dead Japanese. His plan was simple and audacious. He divided them into 2 groups. The first, under his command, would fight its way to the barge. The second would delay the soldiers by creating a barricade in the main corridor. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. But in the eyes of the men he chose for the second group, there was no fear, only cold rage. They had already seen what happened to their comrades, to the women, to the children. To die fighting was a better end for them than waiting their turn. The farewell was brief. A nod of the head, a look in the eye, that was all. And then all hell broke loose. While shots and screams echoed from the main building, Lin's group, hunched over, made their way through the dark, fetid corridors of the morgue. The smell of death was familiar here, but now it was mixed with the smell of burning, taking on a new, sinister quality. They emerged into the service yard and froze. The pier was only 100 meters, about 330 feet, away. 100 meters of open, exposed ground. In the distance, they could see the figures of Japanese patrols. Lin Wei made his decision instantly. Wounded! To the pier! 1 by 1! Run for it! We'll provide cover! And they ran. It wasn't a run, but a desperate dash toward salvation or death. The air whistled with bullets. One of the wounded fell. Then a second. No one stopped to help. They couldn't. This was the law of the new world that Lin Wei had established without words. Reaching the pier, they saw the barge. It was huge and empty. Piles of coal dust lay on the deck. The wooden flooring was rotten in many places, but it was their ark. The problem was, the barge was moored to the pier with thick, tarred ropes. They had no time to untie them. One of the soldiers took out an axe they had grabbed from a utility closet and started chopping. Every blow of the axe sounded louder than a gunshot in their ears. It felt like it could be heard across the river. While he chopped, the others began hauling the rescued aboard. It was monstrous work. They carried groaning, bloodied bodies, slipping on the icy planks of the pier. Mailing, this fragile 19-year-old girl, carried a man twice her weight on her back. There was no longer fear in her eyes, only a primal, animalistic determination. Finally, with a loud crack, the last rope snapped. The barge began to drift slowly, lazily, away from the pier. But now they faced a new problem: the current. The river was relentlessly pulling them back toward the shore, toward the burning city. They had no motor, no oars, only a few long poles that the coal workers used to push off the bottom in the shallows. Lin Wei grabbed one of them. The other men followed his lead. They braced the poles against the muddy riverbed and began to push. It was a titanic, thankless task. Their muscles burned, their lungs felt ready to burst. But they pushed. They pushed their island of salvation away from the shore where certain death awaited them. And slowly, centimeter by centimeter, the barge began to move toward the middle of the river. When they were far enough away, they all collapsed onto the deck, exhausted. They lay among the wounded in the filth and coal dust and watched the receding shore. Watched what had so recently been their home, their world. The city was on fire. Black smoke filled the sky. And in this apocalyptic picture, they were just a tiny dot, a splinter carried by the current into the unknown. The first night on the barge was a night of realization. When the adrenaline of the fight faded, it was replaced by cold, pain, and despair. They conducted their first inventory. They had about 30 seriously wounded, whom they placed under a makeshift tarpaulin shelter. Another 40 people, women, the elderly, children, and a few lightly wounded who could still move. Medical supplies were critically low. A few packs of morphine, a little sulfanilamide, several rolls of bandages, drinking water, a few flasks. There was no food at all, but their most fearsome enemy was not the lack of supplies. Their most fearsome enemy was the river. The Yangtze is not a gentle stream. It is a powerful, unpredictable force of nature. The current constantly dragged them toward one bank or the other, and on both banks was hell. On one side, the burning city of Nanking, where the massacre continued. From there came screams, gunshots, and the drunken laughter of the victors. On the other side was the countryside, which was also now occupied by Japanese troops. Patrols scoured the banks for refugees. The barge, drifting in the middle of the river, was a perfect target for them. All night, the men, taking turns, pushed with the poles, trying to keep their fragile world in the center of the waterway. It was a battle with a hydra. As soon as they pushed off from one unseen obstacle on the bottom, the current would immediately start carrying them toward another. Lin Wei realized they wouldn't last long like this. The people were exhausted. They needed someone who understood the river, someone who spoke its language. And then he remembered. Among the wounded they had picked up at the pier was an old man. Quiet, withered, with a face like the bark of an old tree. He was a boatman. He had spent his entire life on this river. His name was Uncle Joe. Lin Wei found him on the stern. The old man was sitting with his arms wrapped around his knees, silently staring at the water. His leg had been shot, but he seemed not to notice the pain. Lin Wei sat down beside him. He didn't give any orders. He simply asked, "Grandfather, how do we survive?" The old man was silent for a long time, then slowly, as if reluctantly, he began to speak. He spoke of currents that changed depending on the time of day, of sandbars where they could hide from patrol boats, of abandoned jetties where they might find forgotten sacks of rice or fishing nets. He spoke of the river as if it were a living thing, with its own character, its own whims, its own secrets. And Lin Wei listened. The surgical genius, the man of science and logic, listened to the old, illiterate boatman, and he understood that this old man's knowledge was now more important than all his diplomas and scientific degrees. This was their first victory. Not over the enemy, not over hunger, but over their own ignorance. They realized that their greatest ally and their greatest enemy was the river. And to survive, they had to learn to use its power. That same night, under Uncle Joe's guidance, they made their first invention. They took several heavy chains left on the barge, tied them together, and attached a large piece of a metal structure to them. The result was a makeshift anchor. Now they could at least temporarily fix their position by dropping the anchor on the sandbars that only the old man knew about. This gave them a few precious hours of rest. It was a tiny victory, but it instilled a fragile hope in the people. They were no longer a helpless splinter. They had become a ship, a ghost ship, but a ship nonetheless. But their first small victory did not go unnoticed. At night, when fog descended on the river, turning their barge into an invisible island, they heard a sound, a steady, mechanical hum that grew louder and louder. It was the sound of a motorboat, a Japanese patrol boat. The sound of the approaching engine hit the people on the barge like the crack of a whip. Panic, which until now had been smoldering under the ashes of exhaustion and despair, threatened to erupt. Someone began to cry. Another started praying aloud. Linway realized that in another moment they would lose control. He had to act, and he used the only weapon he had, cold, ruthless reason. He gave the order in a whisper, but his voice was as hard as steel. "Everyone down! Don't move!" Not a sound. The people obeyed instinctively. They flattened themselves on the filthy deck amidst the coal dust and dried blood, becoming a shapeless mass of shadows. The fog was their only salvation. It enveloped the barge in a thick, milky cocoon, reducing visibility to a few meters. But the sound of the motorboat grew closer. It seemed to be heading straight for them. Any second now, a dark silhouette would emerge from the fog, a searchlight would flash, and then it would all be over. Linway lay on the deck, pressing himself against the cold, wet planks. He could feel his heart pounding wildly. In that moment, he was not a doctor, not a commander. He was just a living creature, seized by primal fear. He looked at Mei-Ling lying beside him. She wasn't crying. She was staring at him with wide-open eyes that held a silent question. What now? And he didn't have the answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. And it was in that moment that salvation came from where he least expected it. Uncle Joe, the old boatman, crawled over to him. His face was calm. He pointed his hand to the side, perpendicular to the direction of the sound. "The current," he whispered. "It splits here. The boat will follow the main channel. We're being carried toward the old wreck. They won't see us if we stay quiet." This wasn't hope. It was certainty. The certainty of a man who knew every bend of this river, every one of its whims. Linway looked into the old man's eyes and believed him. He passed the order down the line. Silence. No matter what happens, silence. The roar of the engine reached its peak. The boat seemed to be just meters away. They could hear the voices of the Japanese soldiers, their laughter. A searchlight beam cut through the fog somewhere very close, snatching patches of white mist from the darkness. One of the wounded groaned. Mei-Ling instantly crawled to him and clamped a hand over his mouth. She looked into his eyes, pleading, commanding him to be silent, and he fell silent. Those few minutes lasted an eternity. Time stretched, becoming thick and viscous like the river silt. And then the humming began to fade, slowly, reluctantly. It grew quieter and quieter until it dissolved completely into the night's silence. They were saved. When all was quiet, the people lay motionless for a long time, afraid to believe in the miracle. Then someone let out a soft sob, and that sob was taken up by others. It wasn't a cry of despair. It was a cry of relief. That night, they learned a second important truth. Their empire would be built not on strength, but on knowledge. Not on weapons, but on cunning. Starting the next day, their lives fell into a harsh but orderly rhythm. Under Uncle Joe's guidance, they learned to read the river. By day, they hid in a labyrinth of small channels and reed-choked backwaters unknown to the Japanese patrols. At night, they moved out onto the open water and drifted downstream. Lin Wei, in turn, built a state within a state on the barge. He divided the deck into zones: an operating room under the tarpaulin canopy, an infirmary for the seriously wounded, a living area for women and children, and a galley where a meager soup was cooked in a single pot from whatever they managed to find. He imposed the strictest discipline. Rationing was taken to an absurd level. Every sip of water, every piece of hardtack was accounted for. The punishment for stealing food was singular: exile. In other words, certain death. He organized night raids. A few of the strongest men, under the cover of darkness, would paddle a makeshift raft to destroyed coastal villages and warehouses in search of supplies. These raids were deadly dangerous, but they were necessary for survival. Their small floating state lived. It fought. It clung to life. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of this new, cruel world. In the darkness among the groaning wounded, a rebellion began to brew. The discontent began with whispers. At first, they were just complaints about the hunger, the cold, the cruel rules of Dr. Lin. The people, snatched from hell, had expected salvation, but they got a new prison. A floating one, but a prison nonetheless. The epicenter of this discontent was Xiong, a former corporal in the Kuomintang army. A strong, broad-shouldered man with a loud voice and simple, understandable desires. He'd been wounded in the leg, but the wound was not fatal. Unlike many others, he had retained his physical strength and his will, and he didn't understand why they had to obey this cold, arrogant doctor who, in his opinion, had simply lost his mind. Xiong considered Lin's plan to be madness. Drifting endlessly down the river, hiding from patrols, living on the verge of starvation. This wasn't a plan. It was a slow suicide. Xiong had his own plan, simple and logical, like a bayonet thrust. They needed to land on the shore and fight their way to the international safety zone in Nanking. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, many might die. But it was a chance to return to civilization, to a normal life. What Lin Wei was offering was a road to nowhere. Gradually, a group of supporters began to gather around Xiong. They were mostly soldiers like him, lightly wounded. Men accustomed to solving problems with force. They didn't trust the doctor's cunning plans or the old boatman's quiet magic. They believed in rifles and grenades. The conflict simmered for several days. It manifested in small things: defiant responses to orders, violations of rationing rules, open contempt for the useless wounded. Lin Wei saw it all. He understood that his fragile empire was on the brink of a civil war, and he knew that if he gave in, if he showed weakness, everything would collapse. They would all die. The direct confrontation occurred on the 5th day. At night, during the distribution of the daily ration, a few spoonfuls of thin rice gruel, Xiong openly challenged the doctor. He stood in the middle of the deck and loudly declared that he would no longer obey the orders of a madman. He called on anyone with a drop of courage left to take up arms and join him in a breakout. His words found an audience. Many hesitated. The prospect of feeling solid ground under their feet again, even if it meant paying in blood, seemed tempting. Lin Wei stood before him, saying nothing. He was one man against a dozen angry, desperate men. He could have tried to reason with them, told them that the international zone was just another trap, that the Japanese respected no rules. But he knew that words were powerless here. And then he did something no one expected. Slowly, without taking his eyes off Xiong, he walked to the edge of the barge. There lay one of the most severely wounded, a boy of about 15 with a shattered pelvis. He was dying, slowly and painfully. Lin Wei silently lifted him into his arms. The boy was as light as a feather. The doctor held him up and offered him to Xiong. "You want to go? Go," he said in a quiet, even voice. "But first carry him to the shore, and him, and that woman with the baby over there, and that old man. You want to fight your way out? Fine, but you will carry them on your back, all of them, because I am not leaving them here. If we leave, we all leave together, or no one leaves." Silence fell. Xiong looked at the dying boy in the doctor's arms, at his emaciated gray face. He looked at the dozens of eyes fixed on him with hope and fear. He was a soldier. He knew how to kill, but he was not prepared to be an executioner for his own people. His resolve wavered. He slowly lowered his head. The mutiny was crushed, not by force of arms, but by the force of the moral choice Lin Wei had presented him with. He had defended his law, but while they dealt with each other, they failed to notice their true enemy, nature, preparing its final, devastating blow. The internal enemy had been defeated, but the victory came at a high cost. The fragile unity of the barge's inhabitants was broken. Xiong's group fell silent, but mistrust and hidden animosity hung in the air. The people were exhausted not only physically but morally, and it was at this moment that fate struck a double blow. The first blow was disease. The unsanitary conditions, the dirty river water they boiled over a weak fire, and the general weakening of their bodies led to an outbreak of dysentery on the barge. The disease cut people down without distinction, both the wounded and the healthy. First one child fell ill, then several more people. Within 2 days, a third of the floating hospital's population was writhing in agony, suffering from fever and dehydration. Lin Wei had almost no medicine. The few sulfanilamide tablets he had been saving for the most severe cases were gone on the first day. All he could do was give the sick a tea made from willow bark, which Uncle Joe said helped reduce fever, and force them to drink boiled water. The barge turned into a floating infirmary for the dying. The smell of sickness mixed with the stench of pus and death. The hope that had just begun to bloom in people's hearts was fading with each passing day. And when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, the second blow came. It happened at dawn. The thick, pre-dawn fog, their eternal savior, was unusually thin that morning. Visibility was almost perfect. They were drifting in the middle of a wide stretch of the river when Uncle Joe, who was on watch, let out a soft, choked cry. He was pointing at a bend in the river ahead. From behind the cape, a dark silhouette was slowly emerging. It was not the small patrol boat they had learned to deceive. It was a full-fledged river gunboat, armed with machine guns and a small caliber cannon. It was moving slowly, scanning the river. They had been spotted. There was nowhere to run. Hiding was pointless. This time, neither fog nor the old man's knowledge of the currents would save them. They were completely exposed. On the gunboat, they were probably already aiming the machine guns at them. In a few seconds, minutes at best, their fragile world would be torn to shreds by a storm of lead. There was no panic. The people were too weak and apathetic for panic. They just lay or sat, silently staring at their approaching death. Xiong and his men grabbed their rifles, but everyone knew it was futile. A few rifles against machine guns and a cannon, that wasn't even a fight. It was suicide. Lin Wei stood at the bow of the barge, watching the gunboat. His mind, trained to make decisions in fractions of a second, frantically searched for a way out. Surrender. They would kill all the men and take the women. Try to flee? Impossible. Fight back? Insanity. It seemed there were no options. And then his gaze fell upon what was both their curse and their only asset. The sick. The dozens of people tossing in fever. And in his head, the last, most desperate and most brilliant idea was born. He turned to Mei Ling and the few remaining nurses still on their feet. "Get all the sick up," he ordered. "Everyone who can stand, line them up along the side." Not understanding his plan, the nurses rushed to obey. They lifted the enfeebled people, setting them on their feet, leaning them against the side facing the gunboat. Soon, a living wall of human suffering lined the entire side of the barge. People in dirty, blood-stained rags with emaciated, gray faces and eyes clouded by disease. Someone coughed up blood, another vomited directly over the side. It was a monstrous sight, the apotheosis of misery and sickness. Then Lin Wei did the most terrifying thing. He took a piece of white cloth, drew a red cross on it with charcoal, and tied it to a long pole. He stood in the most visible spot and raised the flag high, the flag of a hospital, the flag of inviolability. The gunboat slowed its approach and drifted to a stop about 200 meters away. In the ensuing silence, they could hear the creaking of their old barge. Everyone waited for the burst of machine gun fire, but it never came. From the gunboat, they were examining the strange vessel through binoculars. They saw the flag with the red cross. They saw the line of people barely able to stand. They saw what any military doctor would identify at a glance, the signs of an epidemic: cholera, typhus, plague, something contagious and deadly. The Japanese, who had a mortal fear of epidemics, did not risk approaching. To them, this barge was not a military target but a floating plague ward, dangerous, infectious garbage that was best left untouched. They watched for a few more minutes, and then a command was shouted from the bridge. The gunboat slowly turned and continued upriver, giving them a wide berth. They had won, without a single shot. Their weakness, their sickness, their suffering became their greatest weapon. But the price of this victory was terrible. That same day, unable to withstand the illness and the nervous strain, Mei Ling died. She died quietly, in Lin's arms. Her last words were not to him, but to the mother she called for in her delirium. And in that moment, looking into her cooling eyes, Lin Wei made his final decision. They had to break through. Not to some mythical safety zone, but down the river, toward territories not yet occupied by the enemy. Away from this cursed land. Mei Ling's death was the final straw that broke the camel's back of patience and suffering. She had been a symbol of innocence, of hope, and her passing meant that hope was gone. At least here, on this dead river, in the shadow of the burning city. Dr. Lin's decision to break through downstream was met with silent agreement. Even Xiong and his men understood it was the only way out. To stay here meant a slow death from disease and starvation, waiting for the next patrol boat to have a more resolute commander. But breaking through was easier said than done. Dozens of kilometers of enemy territory lay ahead. The river was patrolled. The banks were dotted with Japanese posts. Their barge was slow, clumsy, and completely defenseless. Their only chance lay in a plan devised by two completely different men, the genius surgeon Lin Wei and the illiterate boatman Uncle Joe. The plan was based on audacity and knowledge. They would move only at night, using the darkest, moonless hours. By day, they would have to hide. Not in the reeds where they could be easily spotted from the air, but in the river's dead zones that only the old man knew about. These were deep pools under steep banks cluttered with sunken trees where their barge would be almost impossible to see. The riskiest part of the plan was passing Nanking itself. The city and its surroundings were the most heavily fortified section. Here, they would have to navigate a true corridor of fire. Uncle Joe proposed using the Dragon's Current for this. A powerful, swift current formed where the Yangtze merged with one of its tributaries. The current was dangerous, unpredictable, but it could carry them past the city in a single night. Preparations for the breakout took 2 days. They gathered all their remaining food. They reinforced the tarpaulin shelter. They made several makeshift oars from planks to help with the current on the turns. Lin Wei checked on all the wounded. For those who were in the worst shape, he administered the last dose of morphine. It was an act of mercy and at the same time, a cruel necessity. They must not cry out in pain at the critical moment. On the night of the breakout, an impenetrable darkness fell upon the river. There was no moon, no stars. Perfect conditions. Uncle Joe stood at the makeshift rudder on the stern. His face was like a mask carved from stone. He was calm and focused. The lives of everyone on board now depended on his skill. They weighed anchor and entered the dragon's current. The barge was caught and swept away. The speed was incredible. The banks, barely visible in the darkness, rushed past. The water churned and foamed. The old vessel was tossed from side to side, creaking and groaning as if it were about to fall apart. The people clung to the sides, to the deck, praying to all their gods. And then, ahead, they saw lights. The lights of burning Nanking. It was a ghastly, mesmerizing sight. The city was burning like a giant funeral pyre. Against this glow, their barge was clearly visible. They had entered the most dangerous zone. Soon they saw the first searchlight. A bright, blinding beam swept across the water, snatching sections of darkness. It was slowly moving toward them. Everyone froze. Uncle Joe shouted something, and the men at the oars pulled with all their might, trying to steer the barge into the shadow of a high bank. The beam passed just meters from their stern. They had slipped through. But a few minutes later, a second searchlight appeared, and then a third. They were caught in a trap of light, and then a machine gun opened fire from the shore. Tracer rounds stitched through the darkness, skipping across the water right beside them. Someone screamed. Panic began to set in, but the scream was drowned out by a new, deafening sound. It was Lin Wei, standing at the bow, who began to beat on a large metal basin they used as a gong for signals. The loud, booming, monotonous sound carried across the river. The Japanese on the shore momentarily ceased firing, puzzled by this strange noise. They didn't understand what was happening. They couldn't imagine it was just a handful of refugees. The sound, the sheer audacity of it, led them to assume it was some kind of military ruse, a trap. While they hesitated, the barge, driven by the current and the desperate efforts of the rowers, passed the dangerous section and plunged back into the saving darkness. They had broken through, exhausted, terrified, but alive. They had left the burning city, and it seemed hell itself behind. They were sailing into the unknown, but it was an unknown that held hope. After the breakout past Nanking, a relative calm settled in. They sailed for several more days and nights, trying to stay far away from major settlements. The hunger became unbearable. The disease had receded, but it had claimed several more lives. The people had become shadows. They barely spoke, conserving their strength. Their entire existence was reduced to a few simple actions: rowing when necessary, drinking water, and waiting. Finally, on the 7th day of their journey, they saw soldiers on the bank. But these were not Japanese. The uniforms were different. They were Chinese, soldiers of the National Revolutionary Army. They pulled ashore. The first moments of euphoria were indescribable. People cried, laughed, tried to hug the soldiers. They kissed the ground, the solid, reliable earth beneath their feet. It seemed their nightmare was over. They were saved. But the euphoria faded very quickly. It was replaced by confusion and then disappointment. The soldiers and officers who met them looked at them with suspicion. Their story of a floating hospital sounded like the ravings of madmen. Dirty, ragged, exhausted people on an old coal barge claiming to be doctors and nurses. It was too incredible to be true. They were separated and interrogated. The interrogations were conducted by a young, well-groomed counterintelligence officer. He was polite, but his eyes held a cold cynicism. He didn't believe a single word Lin Wei said. To him, they were at best deserters who had fled the battlefield, and at worst, Japanese spies trying to infiltrate behind the lines disguised as refugees. Lin Wei tried to explain. He told them about the massacre at the hospital, about the decision to take to the river, about the struggle for survival. He spoke calmly, logically, providing details that were impossible to invent, but the officer just smirked. "A doctor?" he said, examining Lin's calloused, dirty hands. "You look more like a coal hauler. Where are your papers? Where is your proof?" And they had no proof. Everything had burned in Nanking. Their only evidence was the barge itself and the few surviving wounded who could corroborate their story. But for the military bureaucracy, that meant nothing. The system could not accept something that didn't fit into its neat boxes. The story of a handful of medics who created an autonomous sanctuary and saved dozens of lives was too inconvenient. It highlighted the helplessness of the army itself, which had failed to protect either the city or its people. They were held under arrest for several weeks. The wounded were sent to a rear echelon hospital, the women and children to a refugee camp. The men, including Lin Wei and Xiong, continued to be interrogated. In the end, finding no evidence of their guilt but still not believing their story, the authorities made the simplest decision. Their brotherhood, forged in hell, was destroyed. Their heroic deed was buried under the classification unconfirmed. The old barge, their ark, their fortress, was simply towed to the bank and left to rot. It was a silent witness to their incredible story, but no one wanted to listen to it. For the heroes, this was the final, most cruel blow. They had survived the massacre, conquered hunger, disease, and fear. But they lost when they collided with the soulless machine of the civilized world. Salvation had become a new prison. Victory, oblivion. The fates of those who survived on the floating hospital varied. Their paths diverged, and they dissolved into the vast churning cauldron of war and post-war chaos. Dr. Lin Wei, after several months of humiliating investigations, eventually managed to confirm his qualifications. He was sent to work in a rear echelon hospital in Chongqing. Once again, he held a scalpel in his hands. Once again, he stood at an operating table. But he was a different man. His former self-assurance, his cold detachment was gone. He became quiet, withdrawn. His colleagues respected him for his golden hands, but feared his heavy, vacant stare. It seemed he wasn't looking at his patients' wounds, but through them into some terrible abyss. He never told anyone what had happened on the river. That experience remained his private hell forever. It was said that after the war, he moved to a remote village and worked as a simple country doctor for the rest of his days, helping peasants for free. He died in silence and obscurity, and his gravestone bore no inscription that this humble old man had once been the captain of an entire ark. Xiong, the former corporal, lost his leg to gangrene that developed from his wound. He was discharged from the army. Embittered at the world, he wandered the country for a long time, surviving on odd jobs. He could forgive neither the Japanese nor his commanders, nor even Dr. Lin. It seemed to him that everyone had betrayed him. His trail went cold in Shanghai in the late 1940s. He likely perished in one of the countless street clashes of that era. Uncle Joe, the old boatman, simply vanished. On the very first day they were brought ashore, he melted into the crowd of refugees. For him, a man of the river, the land was foreign and hostile. He probably found himself a new boat and spent the rest of his days plying the great river, holding in his memory the story of the strange ship on which he had served as helmsman. The other survivors also scattered across China. Their shared secret, their shared terrible memory was the only thing that bound them. But they never met again. Each of them carried a piece of the story with them, which over time turned into a vague, nightmarish tale. Their feat was officially forgotten. Not a single mention of the barge that for a few terrible weeks became the only island of life in the middle of a river of death remained in the archives. But, as the old people who lived on the banks of the Yangtze used to say, for a long time after the war, a strange belief circulated among the boatmen. They said that on foggy nights, you could sometimes encounter a ghost ship on the river, an old, clumsy barge gliding silently on the water against the current. And if you listened closely, you could make out quiet groans, the cry of a child, and the steady, calm voice of a doctor giving commands. Official history is written by the victors. It consists of the dates of major battles, the names of generals, and dry casualty figures. In this history, there is no place for the small, inconvenient tragedies and incredible feats that do not fit the grand narrative. The story of Dr. Lin Wei's floating hospital was exactly that, inconvenient, unbelievable, and therefore doomed to be forgotten. The system, be it military or civilian, does not tolerate anomalies. And what these people did was an anomaly of the highest order. They went beyond the rules, beyond logic, beyond the very concept of possible. They turned their weakness into a weapon and their despair into a plan of action. They built their own small, fragile civilization in the midst of absolute chaos, proving that the human spirit and the will to live can stand against even the apocalypse. But for history, their feat was too small. Dozens of saved lives are but a drop in the ocean of the millions who died in that terrible war. Their barge did not change the course of a single battle. Their names did not make it onto any list of heroes. Their story was buried alive, like so many others, in the mass grave of the great tragedies of the 20th century. And yet, it did not disappear without a trace. It survived. It became a legend. A soldier's tall tale whispered around a campfire. A scary story that mothers used to frighten naughty children on the banks of the great river. It became a part of folklore, an anonymous monument to all those whose names history has erased. It was said that the doctor who built the ark was actually an immortal river spirit who comes to the aid of people in the darkest of times. It was said that the souls of those who died on that barge never left it, forever guarding the peace of the Yangtze. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a parable about how the strongest ark is built not of wood and steel, but of courage, compassion, and an unbreakable will. And even if the world forgets the names of the heroes, the river will remember them forever.